Hello and welcome to this chess video. I'm Master Ingvar Jóhannesson from Iceland, and in this video we're going to look at a famous game by Raul Capablanca, the world champion from Cuba. Now this game I'm calling Capablanca's Umbrella Academy because it introduces a very important concept that you can use in your rook endgames, and a very vital piece of knowledge that can help you in many games. Now, before going on to this game, which happened in 1924, there's a funny story about the game between Capablanca and Tartakower in 1936. Now, Capablanca and Tartakower played 15 games with each other, with Capablanca holding a massive score. He won 6 games. But before their game in 1936, Tartakower had started to hold Capablanca a little bit. He had held him to a draw for 5 games. But yeah, now we're at this tournament. It's 1936. And we're in Nottingham in England. And Capablanca was supposed to play Tartakower in round 1. Unfortunately, just before the round, there was some sad news. Tartakower had been on a ferry, and the ferry didn't make it. It sunk, and apparently Tartakower didn't make it. But just to fulfill the formalities, the clock was started, and while the others were playing their games, the clock started and Capablanca started to, let his mind wander. Wouldn't you know it, 20 minutes into the game, a murmur in the crowd. What's going on? A small and bulky guy enters the room, and he enters the playing hall into the ropes where the players are playing, and he comes to the table against Capablanca and moves his d-pawn, and it was of course a Tartakower, and it was not the late Tartakower because, well, he had cancelled his plans and he actually took another ferry, so he had been presumed dead, but made it there, and, well, Capablanca didn't feel like playing a ghost, so that game in 1936 was a rather uneventful and quick draw. But there was no draw in our game, which was played in 1924, 12 years earlier. I'm gonna have a look at that game. Capablanca had white and Tartakower had black, and the positional Capablanca opened with d4, e6, well, offering Capablanca the French with e4, but knight f3, and we have Dutch defense with f5, c4, knight to f6, bishop to g5, sort of classical old school development, bishop to e7. No nonsense from Capablanca, he just gets his pieces out in a very classical way, e3 and b6 now. And in this line of the Dutch, I think it's a classical Dutch, black is playing for control over the e4 square, similar to what you do in many, like in the Nimzo and Boko Indian type defenses, where you play for control over e4, and then often you actually have the bishop on b4 pinning the knight on c3. But after the bishop arrives here on b7, black is fighting for control over e4. Now Capablanca gets on with logical development. He castles. We have queen to e8. Often a very logical maneuver in these lines to get the queen either to g6 or h5 to help with some sort of attacking plans on the king side. And queen to e2. And this is the first new move that hasn't been replicated since this game, queen to e2. So it seems like Capablanca wants to play e4, and to prevent that, Tartakower plays knight to e4, plucks the knight into e4, and takes control over that square. Capablanca trades, bishop takes e7, and a zug by Tartakower. Perhaps not the best one. I think he should play queen e7 and try to keep the control over e4, and then get on with sort of normal development in such lines. Maybe play c5, maybe swing the knight over to f6, but he figured he'd damage the pawn structure of white by taking on c3 first. Of course, we're attacking the queen, so white's hand is forced. He has to take on c3, and queen takes e7. Now a pawn move by Capablanca. He could have played e4, which is perfectly logical. You've been setting up for that, and black has lost control of the e4 square. And this is probably a slightly better position for white. Most likely he will centralize the rooks and play maybe for d5 or c5. Although the position is rather dry, but black is very solid as well. Instead, Capablanca played a4. And this sort of prepares kind of a little bit of a minority attack, trying to exchange this isolated and sort of bad pawn for a good pawn. But here Tartakower decides to go for an imbalance. He takes on f3. So now we have a bishop against the knight. Knight to c6, another logical move, and black finishes development and has a very solid position. Now a move by Capablanca that I didn't fully understand and doesn't make a lot of sense. He played rook after b1, which seems to indicate that he wants to do something on the queen side. I don't know if he's or was thinking about some c5 or rook b5 at some stage, but it seems to me that this move is a waste of time. And I think the game continuation sort of shows that. Logical move now by Tartakower, rook a to e8. If black is to do something, it will happen in the center. Maybe play g6 and break with e5. Something of that sort. Queen h3 now by Capablanca. This, well, frees the f-pawn and also prevents e5 because now we're targeting the h3 pawn. Rook f6 by Tartakower, and the pawn that was just freed, f4, now prevents black's seemingly made plan of pushing e5. So a bit of prophylaxis here by Capablanca. Now the black knight jumps into a5. Not a very useful square, but most likely black is thinking about some kind of expansion with d6 and c5. The cost is that the knight could be somewhat misplaced on a5. White's queen now returns to f3. It sort of did its job of clearing the way for the f-pawn. And d6 now by Tartakower. Now Capablanca switches plans and plays rook to e1, which to me at least seems to prove that rook b1 was probably a waste of time. The game continues, queen to d7. And finally white pushes e4, which has sort of been in the air for a while, but Capablanca wanted to plan it or get more ready for it with preparatory moves. And now finally he executes the break with e4. Black takes, as otherwise white will get a lot of space and just play e5 and have a nice position. So black takes on e4. Queen takes e4. Hitting of course the pawn in h7, so g6 is played. And now some good positional moves, as you'd expect from Capablanca. He was often very good in these simplistic type of positions, not at all unlike a certain someone from Norway called Magnus Carlsen. So g3, and it's for a reason that placing the pawns on the color opposite your bishop is called the Capablanca rule. They work better with your bishop. If you put it up on opposite color, you're controlling more squares. So g3 of course fortifies the pawn on f4. King to f8. I'm not sure what's going on here, but Capablanca just gets on with little preparatory moves. King to g2. This sort of plugs some holes. Now you're protecting this pawn, you're protecting this pawn if you move to h4, and the king is slightly closer if we get to an endgame, which, as we'll see later in the game, turns out to be the case. Of course you cannot know that at this stage, but you just make these moves on principle, and very often logical play will justify such moves. So rook comes back to f7, and now h4, and another kind of minority attack with h5 is coming. We already ventured on the queen side with a4. So maybe an early version of Alpha Zero with the flank moves. So h4, yeah, the plan is clear to play h5 and try to break through on the king side or create a weakness. Now Tartakower forces the action, and perhaps this is not the best move, but he plays d5. And it looked tempting to force the issue here, but Capablanca was quite happy to take on the endgame. He took on e8 twice, and now h5. Okay, we're threatening h takes g6, taking on h5 allows our rook to get into the game, and once we take here, ooh, then you have two weaknesses here, and the rook will be very well placed on h5. So rook f6 was preferred by Tartakower. Capablanca took on g6, and now rook h1. So open file. We use open files for our rooks. Why? Usually so that we can get a rook to the 7th. That's the goal of having a rook on an open file. King comes over to f8, trying to fortify the king side, but rook h7, of course. Rook c6, and g4 now by Capablanca. Note that black can't take here on c3 because we would play bishop takes g6, and it's an absolute disaster to allow these connected pass pawn in conjunction with a nice rook here, and this would just decide the game. So you can't allow that. So the knight that has been laying dormant here on a5 has to get into the game, and Tartakower went with knight c4. Perhaps knight b3 was a better try, but knight c4 is very logical. But Capablanca, he goes on the king side, g5, fixing the pawn on g6. And here Tartakower went for the line here, knight to e3, trying to activate the knight and block the king side with knight to f5. But here Capablanca had a nice continuation in mind. He took on f5, g takes f5, and this looks like trouble because the pawn is hanging, but in fact Capablanca did not worry about that. It's much more important to get this pawn rolling. Use the rook on the 7th and the bad position of the king, and to do that you must activate your king. So we see the rook, some rook endgame principles that are important. Rook on the 7th, making the king bad, and activity of your pieces. Make the king active in the endgame. Of course Capablanca knew this. After rook takes c3, the king comes to h4, and rook to f3. Some sources have tried a6, but this seems like it's winning for white. King to h5. Let's say we try to make a pass pawn on the queen side, king to g6, and we can make a pass pawn on the a file or the b file. Let's try the a file, but here rook d7 followed by rook takes d5. The rook will be in time to stop the pawn, and once we take this we have what we want, double connected pass pawns, and that's just too strong. The other try b4, then we can check on the 8th and take the pawn, and the rook is in time on the b file, and again double connected pass pawns. So in the game Tartakower tried to eliminate one of the pawns, played rook to f3, g6 by Capablanca, the pawn drops, and now king g5. Rook e4, and here the instructive moment, the umbrella. Welcome to the umbrella academy. King to f6 by Capablanca, using this pawn as a shield from the jacks by the rook. It would have been a mistake to take the pawn, king takes f5, because now once you move in king to f6, black can start checking rook to f4. King comes back, and now we can grab some material, and this will not be enough to offset the 4 pawns. So white will not be able to win here. So Capablanca gave us this lesson. He played king to f6 and using the pawn as an umbrella. Now we're threatening mate, rook to h8, king g8, and now a nice in-between move, a Zwischenzug, rook g7 check. The king has to go to a bad square. If it goes to f8, it's already in the opposition. We can take a pawn and threaten mate. Okay, the rook is here, but now the rook can't go away. But the king went to the corner, but similar stuff. We're again threatening mate, so the black rook must become passive, and that's sort of another principle in the rook endgames. Try to keep your pieces active, and that's precisely what black is prevented from doing. He now has passive pieces. King takes f5. Now we can just take the pawn, because all of the pieces of black are now passive. The rook comes back to e4, the king comes in. Again, we can't take the pawn because of the back rank mate, so rook to f4 check. Now the king comes back, and look at this transformation, g7. Now if you transform into the king and pawn endgame, your king is simply too far away, and the passed pawn decides the game. So Tartakower didn't take, he played king to g8, but now all of a sudden it's white who is winning pawns after sacrificing a pawn in the endgame and using it as a human shield. White is now mopping up everything on the board, and with a protected passed pawn on the 7th and another one running, this game is in the books, and Capablanca won after a few more moves. King to c6, rook takes a4, d6, and Tartakower resigned. A very nice and instructive endgame by Capablanca, and there's a reason why people often talk about Capablanca as an endgame expert. So I do hope you enjoyed that little video and learned something, and also hope you enjoyed the little story about the ghost of Tartakower, and I'll try to look up more stories if you enjoyed that one. I certainly did, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.